Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final meeting of the Turba online program for autumn 2022, which talks about the history of alchemy broadly defined. This autumn, we have been focusing on medieval alchemy, ranging from Arabic to Catalan, and now the medical alchemy of Roger Bacon. We are fortunate to have secured the support of the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom account for our use. And word of warning, this session is also broadcast live on the Shack YouTube channel, and it will be available afterwards. So I'm your host, Jo Pedersen from University of Oxford. I will be taking questions either by please signaling your intention in the chat or raising your hand virtually. Meagan will be talking for around 35 minutes, then we'll start the discussion. I'm hearing some sounds. Everyone, please mute yourself if you can. Let me now introduce our speaker today, Meagan Allen. Meagan is the 2021 to 2023 Kane Postdoctoral Fellow at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, where she works on the intersection of alchemy, medicine, and religion in the works of Roger Bacon. She received her PhD from Indiana University in 2021 and has previously held visiting positions at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science and our Corpus Christi College in Oxford. She's also publishing her book under the title of Roger Bacon and the Incorruptible Human, 2090 to 2092, with the telling subtitle Alchemy, Pharmacology, and the Desire to Prolong Life. And it is coming out, it is planned to be coming out in January 2023. So Meagan will be talking about the role of experiment in Roger Bacon's medical alchemy. So please, Meagan, at your, whenever you would like to share your screen or begin to talk, I will mute myself and let you speak.
All right, thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen. See, all right, everyone can see that? Yes?
Yes, it's absolutely fine, yes.
All right, great. Okay, good afternoon, morning, evening. Everyone, thank you for joining the talk. Thank you to Jo for organizing and asking me to speak, and to Shack for hosting. So as Jo said, I'm the Kane Postdoctoral Fellow at the Science History Institute, where I work on alchemy, pharmacology, and religion in the works of Roger Bacon. So I've recently completed my first book, Roger Bacon and the Incorruptible Human, which is being published by Palgrave Macmillan in their series on medieval and early modern medicine. And barring any further delays in publishing, it should be available next month. So today I'm just going to give you a sneak preview of the book and explain what alchemy looks like in the service of medicine, at least for Roger Bacon. So in a small fragment of the work now called the Libre Secantiarum, Roger Bacon explained that the human body had the potential to be immortal. If Adam had remained in the Garden of Eden, he would have been able to live forever, sustained by the blessed fruit produced by the tree of life. This was God's original plan for mankind. But even though mankind had sinned and thus fallen from grace, Bacon understood the Bible to teach that all humans would eventually reach the ideal state of immortality, albeit only after the resurrection. At the moment of the resurrection, each person, both the saved and the damned, would receive an incorruptible and therefore immortal body, which would be subject to neither disease, decay, nor aging. Despite mankind's fall, Bacon said, wise men could learn much about their future bodies during this life. Not only that, but man could also learn how to make approximations of these bodies so that their own lives would be greatly lengthened. Though no one could live forever before God's judgment and resurrection, wise men might be able to extend their lives by decades, even centuries, through the prolongatio vitae, the extreme prolongation of life. So Bacon believed that the key to extending life lay not in the curricula as taught by the medical faculties of the universities, but in the study of alchemy. But what exactly was it about alchemy that made it so vital to medical practice? Though 12th and 13th century alchemy was generally concerned with the transmutation of metals, Bacon's alchemy was a much larger area of study and encompassed the generation and corruption of all material things in the sublunary world. It was this aspect of alchemy, which Bacon referred to as speculative alchemy, that explained how the four elements interacted with each other to make the basis of reality as man could know it. Thus, the study of alchemy in conjunction with humoral medicine could explain not only how the human body worked, but how it interacted with the materials around it, illuminating the method of prolonging life to extreme lengths. Alchemy provided the ground on which medicine was built, so that medicine without alchemy was unstable. Now, Bacon has been credited as the author of over 100 works, although most of these are likely spurious, attributed to him in the centuries after his death. Despite the numerous misattributions, Bacon's authentic body of work was impressive, and the amount of time he dedicated to the problem of prolonging life over the course of 30 or so years between 1266 and 1292 shows just how committed he was to the concept. Perhaps the most famous of Bacon's works were the opera, composed of the Opus Maius, Opus Minus, and Opus Tertium. Completed between 1266 and 1267, the Opus Maius was written at the request of Clement IV and contains Bacon's plans for educational and ecclesiastical reform through the study of arts and sciences, which Bacon saw as having been neglected in the curricula of major universities. In writing the Opus Maius to Clement, Bacon wanted to demonstrate that not only were the sciences a solid foundation for learning theology, but they could also improve society and help mankind attain salvation. The related texts of the Opus Minus and Opus Tertium were shorter clarifications and emendations to the Opus Maius and were completed between 1266 and 1268. Worried about the dangers of travel, Bacon sent the Opus Minus and Opus Tertium should the Opus Maius not reach its final destination. But these are not merely abridged versions of the Opus Maius. Both the Opus Minus and the Opus Tertium contain much longer sections on alchemy than the Opus Maius. So sometime after sending the opera to Clement IV, Bacon wrote 3 shorter works specifically on medicine. The first, Antidotarius, is largely a description of simple and compound medicines that are available for purchase. Its most notable feature is that while it contains no explicit references to the extreme prolongation of life through alchemy, it stresses the importance of fermentation and the popular idea that a compound medicine was somehow greater than the sum of its parts. That is, a compound medicine's strength was not equal to the sum of the strength of its constituents, but was greater than all of them combined, because during the process of fermentation, the matter of the compound would receive a new form greater than all of the individual forms. Here, Bacon was significantly influenced by the medieval Arabic authors who promoted this idea, most famously Avicenna. Bacon's next medical work was De Orori Busmeticorum, in which he proposed to outline what he saw as the 36 errors of the doctors, by which they were ignorant of their practice and failed their patients. Like the Antidotarius, De Orori Busmeticorum relied heavily on Galenic medical theory, but greatly expanded the role of alchemy in understanding the operations of the human body. It is here that Bacon made the claim that medicine without alchemy was useless, for alchemy was the only subject taught about the generation and corruption of all things on earth. These themes were reworked and elaborated on with greater enthusiasm in the Libre Secantiarum, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Possibly a fragment of Bacon's unfinished Scriptum Principale, or the final section of the Compendium Studii Philosophiae, it was likely written later in Bacon's life and describes how 3 special sciences, alchemy, astronomy, and perspectiva, can prolong human life to great lengths. The final work that deserves attention is not entirely by Bacon, but rather consists of Bacon's introduction and glosses to a much older work, the Secretum Secretorum. Supposedly a letter from Aristotle to Alexander the Great, the Secretum Secretorum was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages and was translated from Arabic several times. It provided all types of information that an effective ruler would need, as well as medical, astrological, and talismanic advice. As with most of Bacon's medical and alchemical works, the exact date of composition is unknown, although internal evidence places it after 1264 and likely between 1275 and 1280. So these works, written over a period of almost 3 decades, demonstrate Bacon's commitment to the idea that it was possible to extend human life using a combination of alchemy and medicine. He had good reason to be committed. Bacon believed that as man was made in God's image, the study of the human body was one of the most noble studies outside of theology. God had created both the bodies and the rational souls of men, the latter of which were immortal and desired the felicity that they would have in an immortal body after the resurrection. For Bacon, any study that attempted to heal the body and restore even a part of its former glory could not be shunned lightly. So in order to understand how Bacon thought that alchemical remedies could prolong human life, we must first understand how Bacon believed decay happened. What caused the body to die, either at its appointed time or before? What was the mechanism by which the body became corrupt? Understanding how Bacon thought these natural processes occurred is vital to understanding how and why he believed that not only was it possible to extend life, but how alchemy provides the techniques to do so. The fact that Bacon saw no fundamental difference between the decay of the biblical patriarchs versus the decay of modern man, that is, the decay of modern man was accidental and not mandated by God or nature, was what allowed him to argue that life could be extended at all. Because it was the result of human, not natural failings, it could be remedied using human sciences and tools. And here's a little bit of shameless self-promotion. So in the Opus Minus, Bacon discussed how human life had become shortened. The biblical patriarchs lived for several hundred years, the natural lifespan of man, although even these men did not live forever, but eventually died. However, after the expulsion from paradise, there had been a deterioration in complexion, resulting in shortened lifespan. Men had begun to sin, which in turn had clouded their judgment. They passed their bad habits on to the next generation, who then compounded these sins and thus had an even shorter lifespan. So this process continued for thousands of years until the present day, Bacon said, when human life had reached its absolute minimum. So the beginning of the Libre Secantiarum contains the following description of the shortening of life over time. Indeed, fathers do not observe this regimen, which consists in moderateness of food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, evacuation and retention, in good air and in passions of the soul, by which not only natural passions, such as pain and hope, fear and joy are understood, but all power and original kinds of faults. Truly no mortal ever maintained moderateness in this, neither doctors nor rich men nor poor men. Therefore, it happened at the start that fathers were corrupted in their complexions and began the continuous abbreviation of life up to now. And therefore, corrupted fathers generate corrupted sons, and sons, by the passing of the defect of the regimen, were corrupted themselves, and therefore generate sons corrupted by a twofold corruption, and thus corruption and the abbreviation of life is multiplied, just as we see and experience in this time. But it was not just sin that caused this shortening of life. Long life was needed in those days for men to accumulate knowledge on all subjects. So here Bacon is referring to an idea of original wisdom held by the first generations that had slowly become corrupted over time. So this is not to say, though, that God instituted this shortening of life because he decreed that men no longer needed to live as long as they had previously. This is entirely mankind's fault. And so humans have to work to fix it using art. So not only is the shortening of life accidental, but it's also remediable. Here's another quote from the Libre Secantiarum. But it is important to understand here that while Bacon believed the human body has the possibility of not dying, he thought that the body could not be immortal until after the resurrection. So the consequence for original sin is death, even if it's just a temporary death. Now, if all bodies decay, then what is the difference between the decay of contemporary man and that of the biblical patriarchs? Is it a question of speed, or is there something fundamentally dissimilar about the two modes of decay? And the answer to this question is important because it has implications on if and how the shortening of life can be remedied. If the decay of patriarchs was fundamentally the same as the 13th century decay, then it is possible to prolong life. It's trickier to argue that such prolongation of life is possible if decay is different. So Bacon believed that the men of the Old Testament lived to be about 1,000 years of age, but in the 13th century, men barely lived to 80, and their life is one of pain and toil. But again, this decay is not ordained by God and is instead accidental and against nature, and comes from the neglect of the regimen of health. So Bacon distinguished between two limits of life. One was that which was able to be passed, that is, the limit set by not following the regimen of health and incorporating the sins passed from father to son. The second was the limit ordained by God in nature, and this could not be passed. So Bacon takes evidence not only from the numerous stories of men who have been able to extend their lives using experiment, but also from scripture. So man had the possibility of not dying, as evidenced by the fact that Adam would have lived forever had he remained in a state of sinlessness in the Garden of Eden. So the difference in the cause of death between 13th century man and the biblical patriarchs is not an alteration of the body, but rather a speeding up of the natural process that the body would eventually undergo. So Bacon taught that not only was the extreme prolongation of life possible, but that there were a number of different fields that could teach this process with varying degrees of success. The first, of course, is the field of medicine. While Bacon believed that medicine had many faults, it could not be rejected in the prolongatio vitae. Much like sin had clouded mankind's ability to follow the regimen of health over generations, poor translations, excessive reliance on authority, and a lack of solid theory meant that medical errors were passed from one generation to the next. And much like life could be prolonged despite mankind's sins, so too could medicine be revived and reformed through the use of alchemy. Now, Bacon argued throughout the 30 years that he wrote on the prolongatio vitae that art could perfect nature in many ways. In part 5 of the Opus Maius, he said that, quote, whatever nature can do, art perfecting nature can accomplish in greater measure. This included the ability of alchemy to rectify the human body, something which Bacon repeatedly stressed that the Latin doctors were ignorant of. In the Opus Tertium, Bacon wrote that medicine could not work without the knowledge of speculative alchemy. Speculative alchemy allowed one to understand natural philosophy, which in turn led to the understanding of speculative medicine, which finally led to the understanding of practical medicine and the treatment of patients. Indeed, speculative alchemy was one of the greatest areas of knowledge. Alchemy taught two things, both of which were useful, but one significantly more so than the other: the creation of noble metals and colors, and how to prolong human life. Few people knew how to accomplish the first, and even fewer knew the second. Speculative alchemy taught about the generation of things from the elements, while practical alchemy taught how to improve upon the works of nature. And so to be ignorant of alchemy was to be ignorant of generation, natural philosophy, and all things that come from these. As a science, alchemy was so important because of its utility to humans. And like many of Bacon's sciences, he divided alchemy into two types, practical and speculative. Practical alchemy taught how to make colors and metals, but more importantly, it taught how to improve the orthodox medicines available. Speculative alchemy taught about the generation of all things in the sublunary world from the elements. So this made it incredibly important for medicine because by learning about the generation of things from the elements, one could learn about their properties and natures, as well as universals and particulars, things that could only be learned from alchemy. Specifically, alchemy taught about the 12 corporeal substances, which Bacon labeled, quote, the 4 elements and 8 others, which comprise natural generation and could not be learned about elsewhere. In De Orori Busmeticorum, Bacon explained that there were 3 layers of materials that made up the natural world: the elements, the simple humors, and the complex humors. The first layer, that of the elements, consisted of fire, air, water, and earth. All 4 elements combined with each other in different proportions to create the 4 simple humors: blood, phlegm, choler, and melancholy. Each humor was defined by the dominant element out of its constituents. Blood was dominated by air, for example. Just as the 4 elements combined in different combinations to form the 4 simple humors, the simple humors themselves combined to make the 4 complex humors. Though Bacon also referred to the compound humors by the names blood, phlegm, choler, and melancholy, he distinguished them from the simple humors, saying that when the physicians refer to humors, they are speaking of the compound humors. The compound nature of the humors had originally been demonstrated by Avicenna, who had written that if a sample of blood was left undisturbed, it would separate into 4 layers. Bacon claimed that all things, even inanimate ones like stones, were made out of the 4 humors. They were only called blood, choler, phlegm, and melancholy when found in people, but they were the same material in all things. The fact that this sentiment appears in so many works, both those devoted to alchemy and medicine specifically, but also Bacon's works on natural philosophy more generally, highlights its importance to Bacon. So speculative alchemy forms the root of medicine in that it can teach about the properties of not just the human body, but all the medicines that can fix the body as well. So as speculative alchemy taught about the generation and corruption of substances, it likewise taught about their potential incorruptibility. Bacon, loosely borrowing from Aristotle, wrote that incorruptibility was the result of what he called a corpus equale, that is, a body with an equal complexion. If the strength of each element was in the perfect proportion to the rest, then the body would be incapable of decay. Aristotle had taught in the Metaphysics that this was the result of the inability of one element to act upon the others. Bacon agreed, but also said that decay was impossible because the prime matter had finally acquired the proper form, which was the form of equal complexion. Some things already had a corpus equale: gold, which could not be destroyed by air or fire, the immortal resurrection body granted by God, and finally, things that were produced through art and nature, namely alchemy and experimental science. So speculative alchemy could then provide the key to making the human complexion more balanced and thus making it less corruptible and extending life. So Bacon wrote that the secret of secrets is being able to make any quality of the qualities in the humors. Practical alchemy, on the other hand, largely consisted of preparing medicines to make them both safer and more efficacious, as demonstrated in De Orori Busmeticorum. In this text, Bacon explained that, quote, there is practically an infinite number of other similar examples of drugs from which the virtue should be extracted in order that they may be taken easily and without danger, as shown in the books dealing with drugs. Practical alchemy purified potentially dangerous medicines. These included common simples, popular in 13th century medicine, such as snake flesh and plants like rhubarb. In addition to their beneficial properties, snakes contained venom, and rhubarb on its own could be too hot and had to be specially prepared. These medicines could then purge phlegm and restore the body's natural heat. Metals too could be dangerous. Mercury had the potential to be poisonous and could destroy the senses, and so it had to be sublimed before it could be used in medicine. This idea of separating virtues from gross material is also found in other works, other medical works written around the same time, and may have been sources of inspiration for Bacon. Even substances that did not have any dangerous or gross qualities could also benefit from alchemical preparation. At the time Bacon was writing, precious stones and metals were often incorporated into medicines, especially those for very wealthy patients. While many believed that it was enough to wear the stones as amulets, others, including Bacon, believed that they needed to be ingested. However, De Orori Busmeticorum made it clear that Bacon believed the mere ingestion of these items was not enough to cure disease, as they merely passed through the body without becoming assimilated to its nature. Rather than ingesting them whole, Bacon suggests suggested calcining the stones and metals to turn them into a powder, which could then be mixed with a liquid and consumed. By breaking down the stones, the body was able to assimilate them in a way that it was unable to do with whole stones, in turn making them more efficacious. So this too would make their assimilation easier on the body. The final way to use practical alchemy was to create the metals that will serve as medicines. Bacon taught that alchemy could make gold of 24 grades and more, up to 40 grades. This incorporated the more traditional transmutational alchemy into Bacon's scheme of the prolongatio vitae. Human art and reason could improve on the processes of nature. Bacon excitedly stated that transmuting metals using alchemy and an elixir could, quote, do in one day what nature could hardly do in 100 years. Bacon's dependence on transmutational alchemy and medical theory is evident in this passage. The metals themselves were described as needing an elixir or a laxative medicine to improve their qualities. Both medicines and humans could be cured in the same way by reducing themselves down to a prima materia to remove corruption. Bacon reminded the reader that Aristotle wrote in his Metaphysics that this is the only way to prolong life. Where would one get a substance that can be reduced down to the qualities and then built back up to provide this corpus equale? The Opus Tertium included a discussion of a substance called the ovum philosophorum, or the philosopher's egg, which could be used in this way. The philosopher's egg was described as, quote, a stone that is not a stone and is in every human and in every place and in every time. This egg contained all of the elements and could then be divided into them, earth, water, air, and fire, and then recombined in the correct proportion. Other scholars have identified this philosopher's egg as human blood, although Bacon himself provides a lengthy discussion in the Opus Minus as to what different alchemical authorities consider the best egg to be. So for Bacon, human blood is the best for several reasons. It contains all four simple humors and was similar in composition to the universal prime matter. Man was the pinnacle of God's creation, and as blood was the life force of man, it had an exalted status. Much like in the Opus Tertium, human blood could be distilled into its four elements, at which point the qualities could be isolated and then altered so that each element only had one quality. The elements were then to be recombined in the proper proportion and projected onto the metal, producing a metal better than nature could create. Now, in Bacon's presumed earliest work on the prolongatio vitae, the Opus Maius, alchemy is not a standalone science, but is in fact part of a larger program of natural philosophy. The Opus Maius listed three ways of acquiring knowledge: authority, reasoning, which drew conclusions but did not make conclusions certain, and experience, which made the conclusions certain and removed any doubt. Of the three, experience was the best, reason was acceptable, and authority was not to be trusted. Experience itself could be further broken down into two types: external, which happened through the senses, and internal, which was the result of divine revelation. The patriarchs were given all of the sciences by God, who also gave them long lives so that they could test the conclusions for themselves. Now, for this reason, one of the most important ancillary sciences to the prolongatio vitae was scientia experimentalis, sometimes translated as experimental science. Part 6 of the Opus Maius was dedicated exclusively to experimental science, which Bacon said may open the path to the greatest of secrets, which Aristotle placed in the Book of Life, in his book on the regimen of life. The secret is, of course, how to prolong human life. Experimental science is greater than just the prolongatio vitae, though. Broadly, Bacon's version of experimental science can be defined as a methodology or a directive with which to direct all of the other sciences, with four divisions: experimental astronomy, experimental alchemy, the creation of new technology, and the application of new technology to groups like the Church. Experimental science had three main prerogatives: using experiment to investigate the conclusions reached by the speculative sciences, creating new instruments and data, and providing knowledge of the future. The prolongatio vitae was an example of the first and second prerogatives of experimental science, which taught how to prolong life in several ways, including following the examples of brute animals that have an innate knowledge of how to prolong their lives. Ultimately, experimental science helped art perfect what nature left incomplete. Therefore, it could help the sons of the fathers who did not properly follow the regimen of health, though it would not totally undo their poor complexion. And though the relative importance of alchemy within the prolongatio vitae appears to change over time, we could talk about this later, experience is always an important aspect of medicine and the prolongatio vitae. Asclepius, Bacon says, was the father of medicine, not because he was the first to practice or teach it, but because he was the first to rely on the truth of experience. For Bacon, experience was a necessary criterion for effectively practicing medicine, though he considered experience and experiment to be closely related, and the boundaries between the two are often blurred. Now, Bacon was not alone in demanding a certain level of experience from the medical profession. In fact, testing and experience, especially in pharmacology, went back to antiquity. But physicians did not necessarily have to conduct their own experiments. They could refer to those done by previous physicians. Despite the continual expansion of experimental protocol in pharmaceutical testing, it was practiced only sporadically. Historians of medicine have demonstrated that there's no systematic testing of drugs. What constituted evidence in medicine was an important question in the late Middle Ages, but for Bacon, like many medieval physicians, experience did not necessarily have to be one's own experience. It could be that of a trusted authority. Bacon had a good reason for including the experience of others under the heading of experiment. In De Orori Busmeticorum, Bacon explained that the physicians should be excused for not always having the truth because they were unable to experiment in the same way that others were. Medicine was faced with a problem found in no other discipline. Its subject was the human body, and one could not undertake experimentation on the human body lightly. As Bacon explained in that text, creative and experimental sciences whose experiments are made on inanimate objects can be retested many times until all faults and errors are cast out. But doctors are not able to do this because of the superiority of the material on which they are experimenting. One cannot arrive at truth except by means of experimentation. Therefore, the doctors are excused when they make mistakes more than the other experimental scientists. So here there seems to be an inconsistency between theory and practice in Bacon's experimental method. The inability of alchemical medicine to follow the rules for experiments set out in the Opus Maius. However, this is neither a contradiction nor an inconsistency in Bacon's understanding of the role of experiment in the sciences. Rather, the definition of experiment in the context of Bacon's writings has to be expanded. Again, for Bacon, experiment includes not only the experiments and experience of oneself, but of trusted authorities as well. Proof can be found in the Secretum Secretorum. Bacon's glosses demonstrate that he had seen miraculous medicines, namely the Gloria Inestimabilis, at work, although it was not he who administered them. Bacon wrote, quote, "Indeed, I saw a skilled doctor who, through this medicine, cured the greatest man in France after the king." Though Bacon had not taken the Gloria Inestimabilis himself, or even made it, he had in a way experienced its power and was thus certain of its effects. It is thus within Bacon's, quote, experimental method to consider the stories he heard, especially those that came from seemingly reliable sources, as evidence for the existence of alchemical remedies. The key here is that the sources are reliable. They are not just assumed to be correct because they came from an authority, but because they had proof. His work is full of references to the experiments of other authors, and not just those in the medical field, including Robert Grosseteste, Avicenna, Petrus Peregrinus de Maricourt, and others. A more fruitful approach is to see Bacon as engaging in the typical experiment of his time, not an individual systematic set of experiments done by one person, but rather the incorporation of experiment and results by others. The reports of experiences by a trustworthy authority were considered a type of experiment, especially if they were things that the experimentator could not have personal knowledge of. Ultimately, if truth could only come from one individual's direct experience with things, then our understanding of the world would be incredibly limited. Now, despite allowing for the experience of others to count as experiment, Bacon did not reject self-experiment entirely. there are ways in which the doctor could and should experiment, even if they generally did not. The first method was, of course, using the methods demonstrated by the brute animals in the Libre Secantiarum. These animals, such as eagles, snakes, deer, and even the phoenix, were able to prolong their lives by ingesting herbs and stones. Somehow, these animals had the knowledge that these items were good for them, despite not having a rational soul or any capacity for reasoning. Wise men had been able to prolong their lives by following in the footsteps of these animals, which is a perfectly acceptable means of experiment in Bacon's eyes, and one which the ordinary physician should try as well. The second way for doctors to experiment would be to use alchemy to prepare a body of equal complexion, which provided the means for prolonging human life by restoring elemental balance. Wise men and doctors should strive to experiment with alchemy to create this body of equal complexion. The point is, Bacon did not prohibit experiment in medicine per se, only dangerous experiments that have no backing in alchemical theory. Experiment is needed to remove the errors that had been copied in books and would help physicians deal with factors outside of their control, such as changes in the heavens, innate heat, bad translations in medical texts, etc. Ultimately, Bacon concluded that it had grown more difficult for an individual to extend his life than it was in the first centuries after the decline of man. While certain men, like Adam and the legendary Artephius, were able to extend their lives by hundreds of years, now one could only hope to extend one's life by about 100 years, given the compounding corruptions passed through the generations. Interestingly, Bacon claimed that medicines produced through alchemy, astronomy, and perspectiva could allow one to live longer than the patriarchs. Methuselah, who had the longest lifespan of any individual in the Bible, died at the age of 969. Artephius, however, supposedly lived to be to 1025. But Bacon never explicitly mentions this, although one can only assume it was because Artephius's medicine gave him a more balanced complexion than any of the patriarchs had, which is not in itself necessarily heterodox. Given the nobility of the human body above all other forms of creation, Bacon taught that alchemy's greatest use was in prolonging life and curing diseases. Alchemy also taught man about the future post-resurrection body, which will also be made of a corpus equale. Bacon's approach to medical alchemy was unique, both in relation to the Arabic alchemists, who were mainly interested in transmutational alchemy, and to the medical doctors, who occasionally saw a place for alchemy in medicine, but were, on the whole, unwilling to integrate it into medical theory. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Megan, for this very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you to, yeah, exactly, to turn down the PowerPoint for now. And I would like to open up the floor to questions, as you would like to ask them. I will start by asking if you would like to talk just a little bit more about Bacon's views of nature, because in a way he's I mean, he's saying, okay, art is better than nature, which is quite unusual, obviously, during this time frame, and quite against kind of Aristotelian kind of views. But then, okay, so nature is somehow not perfect. But then, of course, the snakes and these creatures have the knowledge to improve themselves. I mean, did he say how nature became corrupted, or why is it not perfect, and how come humans are better?
He doesn't. He talks about reasons why people think that nature has become corrupted. The most common one that he says is that there's this idea that when God created the universe, everything was at the most advantageous position. So all of the planets, the stars, everything was in the most advantageous position. And so people had longer lives, were healthier, everything in nature was better at this point. And then over time, as the universe moves, things have shifted and the stars have left their advantageous positions, and they're in slightly less benevolent positions. Some are even malevolent. And so they're having these negative effects on the sublunary world. He says this is a really common idea, but it's wrong. And so he says that there is no, it's true that the heavens have changed, and so their effects on the earth have changed, but it's not that it's gotten worse, it's just different. So he says the heavens change about once every 100 years. And so things that are, this is especially important because medicines that would work during the time of, say, Dioscorides will no longer work during his time. Or they'll need to have their dosage adjusted, they'll need to have, they need to be combined with different things, but it's not necessarily that things have gotten worse, it's just that they've gotten different. He wants to make this point because in terms of human life itself, we really have no one to blame but ourselves. He's trying to make the point that people are trying to pass off the blame onto things like, oh, well, we can't control the heavens. And so he's got this, he talks about Silenus, and Silenus has this story of how people who lived during the time of the Emperor Augustus were about 7 cubits tall, and which is about 10 feet. And so, but now they're not. And so he says, well, yeah, people are always trying to use this idea of like the world has gotten worse, but really it's not to do with the heavens. It's just our own fault. We've really messed up, and it's just because of sin. So that's the point he's trying to make. And then he doesn't really connect that to the idea that art can supersede nature, although he is very clear about that art can do what nature can't. But he mostly talks about how art can extend human life, but how art can also make metals that are more pure. So nature can make gold that is of 24 grades, and this is the purest gold that nature can make, and it's incorruptible because it's gold, it's pure, it's 24 grades. Art can make gold that is 24 grades, but art can also make gold that is 30 grades and even up to 40 grades. And they're all incorruptible, but clearly the 40 grades are better than the 30 grades, which is better than the 24 grades that nature can make. So there's different levels of incorruptibility, but that's, yeah. So he doesn't explicitly tie the two together, but he does make it very clear that in terms of the human body, this is our own fault.
Okay, thank you, Megan. There is a question on YouTube at this point from Musa Sen. And he would like to ask whether there is any reference of Jabir ibn Hayyan in the writings of Roger Bacon at all, whether in prolongation of life or any other area.
Yes, so there's been a lot of work done by people like Sebastien Moreau on this connection between the Jabirian school and Roger Bacon, and especially works like the pseudo-Avicennian De Anima, which borrows very heavily from Jabir's ideas. This is very significant on Bacon's idea of a corpus equale, although he does significantly differ from that in that Bacon thinks that there's a universal corpus equale that can provide its equality onto everything, whereas the Jabirian school teaches that there's one, shall we say, one medicine for every individual metal. So yes, there is a lot of reference. I'm trying to remember if he mentions, if there's any explicit reference by name. He does certainly mention Pseudo-Avicenna, De Anima, and Arte Alchemia. So yeah, but there is definitely a connection.
Well, thank you for that. I'm opening up the floor to other questions. Please feel free to ask any questions you like, to raise your hand. I mean, I'm pleased if everyone is. Oh, Dolores has a question. Gary has a question. Okay, Dolores, could you ask your question first, please? And you should unmute yourself.
Can you hear me all right? All right?
Yes, yes. No,
okay. So really, it's a follow-up to your question, Joe. So I've been working on the relationship of Francis Bacon's medicine to Roger Bacon's medicine, and Francis Bacon. I don't know, Meagan, how much you've worked on the comparison, but one of the things that strikes me about Joe's question about why isn't nature perfect? Does nature itself have a kind of, was nature itself given a kind of by inheritance, corruptibility with the sin of Adam and Eve? It's very interesting that Francis Bacon picks up almost all of the points about Roger Bacon's text on the errors of physicians. But one of the things I was wondering is that Francis Bacon says that God is benevolent and therefore puts on the earth the means by which to create the Garden of Eden again, or as it return us to a preternatural state of Adam. And I wondered, do you find this argument in Roger Bacon that somehow God has given us the tools, as it were, in terms of the arts, to be able to return nature to its perfection and also prolong our lives?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to be completely honest. I do not know a lot about Francis Bacon. I generally, I have tried to stay away from comparing the two. And so there is the answer to your question is yes and no. Yes, in that Roger certainly believes that God has provided us the materials with which to make ourselves better. He is pretty clear about that. We've been provided the substances that can make medicines, that can make corpus equale, that can prolong human life, and God is benevolent in that sense. But there is no sense that, I wouldn't say that there's any sense that God has provided us the tools to make nature better. Bacon is very clear about the fact that there is no perfection before the resurrection, either in people or in the body, in the soul, even in the rational soul. There's no perfection of the rational soul before the resurrection, because the rational soul can only be truly satisfied if it is joined as one with an incorruptible body, physical body, because a human is not, Bacon says, a human is not just a rational soul, nor is a human just a body. The humanness is the complete unit of body and soul, and they can only really be happy if they're together. But this can only happen after the resurrection. So God will certainly provide there will be the resurrection, and then there will be the New Jerusalem, and this will be a physical place. We will all have physical bodies. If you are one of the saved, you get to have your physical body with your rational soul, and you get perfect vision. He always describes it in terms of like a vision metaphor. So you'll have perfect vision, perfect understanding of God. And if you are one of the damned, well, you still get an incorruptible body in it so that you can experience the torments of hell for eternity. But it's a physical, everything is very physical. It's real, it's tangible, but it can only happen after the resurrection.
Right, just to be clear then. So if Adam and Eve did not sin, then both nature and human beings would be optimally healthy and not corruptible. Is that right?
if Adam, he's a sort of. If Adam had not sinned, so Adam's body was never perfect. It's never as perfect as the resurrection body. Adam's body is almost perfect. And the fruit of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden was a corpus equale itself. And that would have sustained Adam forever. So Adam's body would just get that little extra push from the tree of life that he would need to live forever. So functionally speaking, yes, he would have been perfect and he would have lived forever in Eden. Bacon is not so concerned about the actual status of the rest of nature or I should say Roger Bacon is not as concerned about the actual status of the rest of nature. Again, he talks about how things change over time, but there's less of this idea that nature itself has become corrupted because of man's sin.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
Hey, can we go to Gary now? Gary, please.
So Meagan, thank you for the absolutely wonderful talk. One of the things you just discussed a little bit ago was that Bacon believed in the heterogeneity of chemical practice, that you required different medicines for different diseases, and hence you would require different chemicals for different processes. Where did alchemy diverge away into thinking that somehow that there was a unique philosopher's stone or a unique elixir? Bacon seemed to have gotten it right in the 13th century. Where did they go off the track?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but Bacon is very clear. So it's interesting because he'll talk about medicines. It depends on which work he's writing, and I have argued elsewhere that I think this is probably due to different the different groups that he's addressing in different works. So in works like De Orori Busmeticorum, which are geared more toward less philosophically bent, more practically bent. He talks about specific medicines like rhubarb, which work against a single humor. But then in the more philosophical ones, he talks about the corpus equale and how that is something that is universal, that will cure anything, any disease, and also prolong life and make you just a generally better person. It also has some ability to improve the mind and improve the soul. So I think that part of it is that he's talking to different audiences throughout his works. Yeah.
Okay, Bill Newman, could you ask a question?
Yes, I'm just curious about the concept of Scientia Experimentalis. It sounds a lot like, Vitruvius's concept of an architect as a kind of director of other people's work. And in fact, John Dee, translated it as archmastery, right? Which really seems very close, in my mind at least, to what Roger Bacon had in mind. So I'm just wondering, is there any way in which Roger actually comes closer to modern ideas about experimentation than, say, Aristotle? I mean, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because I actually think Aristotle was much more of an experimental scientist than, many people do, right? If you look at the meteorology and, the biological works, I think there's actually a fair amount of experimentation in there. But anyway, the question stands.
Yeah, so I see Bacon as kind of like the PI of a lab. He's sort of, and I think that that's kind of how he would see the experimentator, especially when you have so many different things and it's hard to, and he says that it's impossible for one person to know everything. And this is part of why the patriarchs got to have such long lives, was so that they could have knowledge of so many different things. And so it's just impossible for one person to have knowledge of everything. And so you have to have people who are working together so that you can get a bigger picture than you would just necessarily have on your own. And you need someone like him who would direct that, and it would have sort of an overarching idea of where you're supposed to be going with this project. So I think of him kind of like a lab head. You know, he's got a bunch of different grad students working on different projects, and, you know, he brings them in for their weekly meetings.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me, to think of him as a kind of a PI. But at the
Yeah.
same time, you know, I'm wondering if there might be, say, ideas about controls, experimental controls in his work, because this idea was around. I mean, Bernard of
Yeah.
Gordon, for example, has the experiment with the two birds whom you poison, and one of them you give the antidote, the other one that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Does he ever talk about experimental control?
No, he doesn't, at least not in terms of medicine. Yeah, which, as you say, is something that is very common. And I mean, people like Avicenna have their lists of controls for how to test drugs. Galen has lists of controls for how to test drugs. Bernard of Gordon, but he's not referencing any of these. He's not talking about any sort of systematic control. It's just, do the experiments have some sort of backing in alchemical theory?
Okay, thank you.
The next question, Guthrie, would you like to ask it?
Yes, hello. Sorry for not showing my face. I'm in the car on the way home from work. Basically, I was wondering, you mentioned, if I heard you correctly, that Bacon had various alchemical recipes for curing illnesses. So are these in various works that I've not really looked at or heard of much before? Or, you know, I've only really heard of the three main ones. I haven't looked far enough in, but so the recipes are sort of available that he gives of alchemical sorts of remedies.
Yes, he gives alchemical remedies, but he doesn't usually provide the recipes.
Oh, that's annoying. Oh, well.
Yeah, so you have to go elsewhere for the recipes. The difference is, let's see, in the Secretum Secretorum, there is a recipe for this medicine, the Gloria Inestimabilis, but that's not Bacon's recipe. That's the actual pseudo-Aristotelian recipe. Bacon just glosses it. That's one of the best recipes. The Opus Tertium has a recipe for making a laxative for metals and people. That's probably that would be the closest you get, but usually Bacon doesn't. He likes to say that he's interested. He wants to arouse curiosity, not instruct. That's his thing, which is kind of clever in that he can get away with not actually telling anyone how to do anything by saying, no, I'm just here to like show you what the possibilities are. Yes, mercury metal is a laxative, so yeah. So he is more interested in arousing curiosity than in actually providing any sort of practical instruction.
Oh, right, thank you.
Yeah.
I shall look elsewhere then.
I'm actually wondering, I mean, speaking of the PI metaphor, I mean, to what extent you would consider him as a, you know, kind of a theoretician, like a basically just bringing in all the sciences of the period and kind of trying to systematize them, and to what extent, I mean, you get the sense that he actually did the experiments and the work himself.
Yeah, he is a great compiler. That is, the biographers of Bacon from the early 1900s all say that the best thing about him was his ability to compile different sources and make one overarching argument or theory. So yeah, he is, in many ways, he reminds me of people like Vincent of Beauvais, who are writing these large encyclopedias, especially with something like the Opus Maius, which talks about geography, mathematics, astronomy. It's just a list of sciences that are useful to the church. So he is encyclopedic in a way, but he does say at one point that he has spent over £2,000 on scientific instruments and equipment, which is an astronomical amount of money at that time. But then he just sort of, he says he can't do it anymore. And so whether or not it's because he's joined the Franciscan order and they kind of aren't very keen on that, maybe frivolous spending, or his family goes through financial troubles because they backed the king during the revolt with the barons, and so he does complain that his family has lost a lot of money as well. So whether it's because of personal finances or the Franciscan order, he says that was kind of like my past life. I can't really do that anymore. That was before, yeah. So he is doing some experiment, and in his works on things like burning mirrors, it's very obvious that he's been doing experiments and that he's actually tried this out himself. But he doesn't really talk about experiment in the context of medicine, at least self-experiment. Although he does say it's actually not Bacon, it's a spurious work later attributed to Bacon. Bacon claims that he has not included any discussion of the tests he has done on himself because the ignorant will label him as being having done like unconscionable things, and so he can't discuss it because he'll be vilified by the ignorant public. But this is not actually the genuine Bacon. This is someone pretending to be Bacon.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but if you'll join me in thanking Meagan for this really interesting presentation. And well, of course, I invite you to look at her book when it comes out. I'm certainly looking forward to reading it. Turba is ending for 2022. I hope you will join me for next year. I will be circulating a new list probably sometime at the beginning of 2023. Well, thank you again, everyone, for participating and for this exciting discussions. So thank you. Okay, and have a happy Christmas and a wonderful New Year. Thank you.